today is international law, and we're supposed to be using this for your listening log. I hope you've done the preparation beforehand. I hope you managed to remember to bring your PowerPoints with you as well today. So the listening log is just the first 20 minutes of the lecture, so we'll stop at some point. So it is chapter 17 from the book. So, international law. The thing about international law is it's really very different to domestic law, to say Japanese law or British law. In the sense that, if you live in Japan, you have to obey the law. Or if you choose not to obey the law, then you'll get arrested and get taken to court. You've got to go and ask ASICO to defend you in court or something, to get you off. But you really don't have any choice. You've got to do it. And it doesn't matter whether you're Japanese or some other nationality. If you live in Japan, the law's there, and the state can enforce that law. When it comes to international law, there's no equivalent of the state. There's nothing above the nation state, so there's nobody to enforce regulations on different countries. And so actually international law turns out to be agreements between states as to how they will behave. But there's no real international policeman. Even the United Nations can't really make people do things. So, we think about the nation states again. Countries exist within this system of international anarchy that there is nobody to impose rules. The rules that exist for states and countries are simply things that they agree to. And for the states themselves, what's of interest is questions of power and their own interests. So particularly if you're a realist, the only thing that counts is the interest of the state. Now, if it's power and interests of the state that are important, then international law is either going to turn out to be a tool of the powerful, so the United States can basically do what it wants, because there's nobody to make them, or the United States can make other countries do what the United States wants them to do because America's got enough power to do it. So that doesn't sound like a very useful system to have. International law serves the powerful. On the other hand, if states don't have to obey international law, if they can do whatever's in their own interest, then international law would appear to simply be irrelevant. Countries obey it when they feel like it, in other words, when it's in their own interest. But when it's not in their own interest, they'll just ignore it. So that would suggest, well, this is the paradox that it's talking about up here. What, by the way, is a paradox? He's checking her vocabulary list.
Yes.
Paradox.
A situation that seems strange because it involves two ideas or qualities that are very different.
Yeah, so there's a paradox. Either it's irrelevant, it doesn't matter at all, or it's something that's useful just for powerful countries. But what we actually see in practice is that states do negotiate and augment or increase legal regimes. The United Nations has been set up. And there are all sorts of different international agreements that are actually laws. Things like the Geneva Conventions, which refer to what people, armies, countries can do during wartime. Things like the Kyoto Protocol, that's an international agreement. So, states certainly seem to think that it's worth having international law because they negotiate it. And a lot of international debate does actually involve questions of, well, is this legal? In particular, the Iraq War that George W. Bush launched. In the build-up to the Iraq War, there's a lot of very frantic diplomatic activity as America and its allies tried to get a clear resolution from the Security Council authorizing the use of force in Iraq. Now, in the end, America, of course, said, well, that they got one and other countries are not so sure about it. But just the very fact that the United States put all this diplomatic effort into trying to get a resolution, and not just saying, well, we're going to war anyway, suggests that America did feel that it was necessary to demonstrate that they were acting legally. So people do seem to care. And once international laws are enforced, actually the level of compliance with international law is surprisingly high. Even countries like North Korea, for example, in their attempts to develop nuclear weapons, there's this thing called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is supposed to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. And North Korea was a member of that. But they chose to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty rather than simply break it. They just said, okay, we're pulling out and we're going to develop weapons. But just that decision to pull out of the NPT rather than to just develop weapons while they were still in it suggests that they do think that the agreement was important enough to sort of work their way around. Okay. We need to make a distinction here between institutions and organizations. And the way that these words are used in the text, and in this chapter in particular, is different from the way that they're perhaps used normally. In kind of ordinary language, you might think institutions and organizations are pretty much the same thing. A university is an organization, and we talk about universities as being institutions of higher education, or higher education institutions. But in this context, they're different. An institution, as the word is used in this text, is a complex of norms, rules, and practices that prescribe behavior, constrain activity, and shape expectations. So it's not a group of people, it's not an organization, it's simply a set of rules. So the Kyoto Protocol is an institution in this language here. And in this sense, an organization is actually what we would expect it to be, the way we normally describe it. Organizations are physical entities with staff, officers, letterhead, that's paper with the writing paper with the name of the organization and their logo on it. So the United Nations is an organization. It's got a headquarters, it's got staff, it's got its own website. But I say things like the Kyoto Protocol is just an institution. And certainly institutions can exist without an organizational structure. I mean, sometimes you've got both. So at the moment, the international community is trying to destroy Syria's chemical and biological weapons. And there's an organization involved in that, what are they called now, that's doing that. And that organization does exist. It has a staff, it's got a secretary general. And of course, it also has institutions, it's got sets of rules to go with it. for an organization like that to exist, or for the United Nations to exist, the International Atomic Energy Authority to exist, all that you need to have some kind of institutional framework. There has to be a set of rules that have been put in place to create the organization in the first place and to give it the task that it's got to do. So we can have institutions without organizations. You can't have organizations, and you can't have these international organizations without the institutional framework. Okay, so let's look now at some of the different levels at which you can have international institutions. The first level around international institutions, around international, or what are called constitutional institutions. These are the things that actually define the terms of legitimate statehood. What does it mean to be a country? So, you know, suppose tomorrow morning I wake up and I think, I really like being in Japan. I'm going to declare my flat to be an independent empire. I'm going to crown myself emperor of. I'm not going to tell you my address, I want anyone coming to visit me. So can I do it? You know, can I just wake up and declare independence and say my flat is an independent country? Well, I can, but it's not going to work because to be an independent country, you've actually got to get other countries to recognize that you are independent. And it's not necessarily that easy. Take, for example, Taiwan. What is Taiwan? What exactly is Taiwan?
Place.
Place.
China.
A province of China, if you believe the People's Republic of China, yeah. But is it? Is it really a province of China?
That is a viewpoint from the China, but Taiwanese believe that they have their own country.
No, they believe they are China. The rest of it, the bit that's in green on the map, should all be part of Taiwan. It should all be under their control. So what is Taiwan? Is it an independent country?
They have autonomy.
They do, certainly, but who gives them that autonomy?
Other countries that accept to be country as Taiwan.
Yeah, Taiwan, to all intents and purposes, Taiwan is an independent country. The government, Taiwan, there's a government in Taipei, and they do pretty much what they want to do, which is the sign of a sovereign state. The whole point about a sovereign state is that the government, the country, can do what it wants. There's nobody above it. And in that sense, it's clearly nonsense to try and say that Taiwan is a province of China, because the People's Republic of China government in Beijing, I mean, they can say, you're going to do this in Taiwan, but it doesn't make any difference. The Taiwanese will do what they want. But Taiwan is most definitely not a country in this sense up here, and that it's not a member of the United Nations. It's not allowed to join. You know, so, and that's because China won't let them in. You can't, and China, of course, puts a lot of pressure on other countries not to have, say, diplomatic relationships with Taiwan. So Taiwan does not have an embassy in Japan, in Tokyo. But it does have a representative. It's got something that looks very much like an embassy, but it's not. And you know, there are other examples. Well, yeah, but Taiwan's kind of the biggest example. Somalia, for example, it's basically divided into 3 bits these days. The thing that's labelled as Somalia on the map. And again, okay, Somalia is recognised as a country because it definitely was a functioning country at one point. But these days it looks more like 3 different countries run by 3 different governments. So this whole idea of what does it mean to be a legitimate state? Now that's the first part of international law. Yes, you are a country, therefore if you're a country you can join international organizations. Then the next level of institutions, we've got what are the fundamental institutions which provide us with the basic rules and procedures for cooperation and coordination between states. The idea, well, how do we get 2 states to make an agreement? What's accepted as the way of dealing with that? And then finally, you have the issue-specific institutions or regimes, things like the Kyoto Protocol, which it's an issue-specific thing. It's dealing with climate change. Attempts to regulate landmines. Again, it's a single-issue regime that exists. And generally we're talking here about multilateral agreements, that these are agreements not just between 2 countries, but they're agreements that are open in principle to any of the countries in the world to sign up to, and there's often a lot of pressure on countries to sign up to them. And then each country within its own set of rules can determine how the country itself agrees to join these regimes. And these things are often quite complicated. So for example, the United States, the president goes along to the big ceremonies and signs on behalf of the United States, but it doesn't become part of the United States law until Congress actually ratifies the treaty. So you've got things like the nuclear test ban treaty that countries said, okay, we're no longer going to test nuclear weapons, which Bill Clinton signed, but Congress never ratified it either. So America actually isn't committed to not testing its nuclear weapons. Similarly, the Kyoto Protocol, America has never ratified the thing either. I think that'll do for the listening log part of it. Stop there. Okay, let's look at where does international law comes from? What's a little bit of the history of it, and where is it? What is it derived from? The current era in the world, sort of the last 500 years where Europe and then later America have been the dominant powers in the world. This is actually quite unusual for most of the history of the world. Europe was not an important place. China and India, of course, historically much more important, much stronger economically. But the fact that Europe and its offspring, the United States, has been dominant for the last 500 years, and particularly the 20th century, has hugely influenced the ideas of international law. So the historical roots of current international law are in fact based in Europe and ideas of European law. The book that you've got often talks about the Treaty of Westphalia, or talks about post-Westphalian era. And the treaty, or treaties of Westphalia were signed in the 17th century. And this book kind of sees that as a watershed, because in many ways, up until the treaties of Westphalia, sure you had countries, but people's loyalty was much more to their king rather than to the country itself. It was more of a kind of personal loyalty you had. And up until about that time, most of the monarchs in Europe believed in the divine right of kings. The idea here was that kings had been chosen by God. And in fact, when kings are crowned, it's usually done in church, or a cathedral. They get oil rubbed on their head. And the crowning is all about being recognized as God's king. And the divine right of kings means that as a king, because you've supposedly been appointed by God, you can do whatever you want, and kings can do it. But gradually, from England's had a parliament for the best part of 800 years or something, but there've been conflicts between the king and the parliament. But gradually, parliament, elected governments of some kind have come to be seen as the key to legitimacy. That rulers now get their legitimacy, get the right to their position, comes from representation, that you're chosen by the voters. The people have elected you to represent them. And that's what makes you an accepted authority and accepted government. And increasingly ideas of equality, that one vote per person. Of course, in Japan at the moment, there are still issues. Lots of court cases around this issue of equality. The fact that when you look at the sizes of the constituencies that are used to elect the members of the Diet, some of the constituencies have got about 4 times as many voters as others. And so the issue that's been raised is the issue of equality. Right? Everybody's vote should be equal, but if in some places you've got, I don't know how many people, 200,000 voting for their representative, and other places you've got maybe 800,000 voting. And the question is, are people really equal in those circumstances? And the courts are basically saying, no, they're not, and the system has to be changed to produce this level of equality. Equality in terms of voting is actually a relatively new thing as well. The idea of one person, even just one person, one vote. I think the first country to give women the vote was New Zealand. It was only about 100 years ago. And in many other countries, through history, often, even for men to vote, there's often been various kinds of restrictions on it, such as owning a certain amount of property. So only the rich could vote at one stage, that sort of thing. So the very idea that everybody can have a vote isn't that old, it turns out. And the other aspect on the historical roots is that law, you make contractual law, that people agree to do things. The law says yes, you can do that. Now, the development of international laws comes through both informal and formal processes. So formal processes are things like actually signing treaties. But because it is a historical process, lots of things have just developed out of customs. This is the way that things are done. For example, the treatment of diplomats. The idea that embassies are considered not to be a part of the country that they're in. An embassy belongs to the country that runs it. So for the embassies that are here in Japan, in Tokyo, the Japanese police can't go inside the embassies and search them because they're considered part of the country that owns them. Now those things, diplomatic procedures are codified now as the Vienna Accords that were signed in the 1960s. But for a long time, things like that simply developed from practice. That okay, you don't go around locking up ambassadors or chopping their heads off, which is what the Japanese did to the Mongol ambassadors that were sent in the sort of 13th century. Just kill them, teach them a lesson. So things develop from customs as people agree to do it. You then, once you've got norms that exist, rewriting norms can be quite difficult. Getting people to agree that, oh, okay, we'll change the wording of it, but things still need to be kept up to date and to reflect technological changes in the way of life. And what happens more likely is that there is debate and there is reinterpretation of things. Okay, look, now that things have changed, so how do we now interpret this law? And if you think about, this is not international law, but the Japanese situation at the moment, there's a lot of talk about the the interpretation of the Constitution with regards to self-defense for Japan. Now, one thing you could do, of course, is simply change the Constitution and write it in such a way that Mr. Abe can do whatever he feels like doing, or whatever his point is. But actually the debate at the moment isn't about should we change the Constitution to redefine Japan's right to self-defense. What people are actually talking about is is to leave the Constitution as it is, but to look at reinterpreting it. What does that actually mean? Of course, there was an interpretation. So I don't know when this was, in the 1980s or something. They said, okay, look, this is how we understand the Constitution. And now it's another debate that says, okay, well, do we really still want to understand it, interpret it in the same way? Without changing the words, can we look at it differently? And the same thing does happen in international law as well. And of course, the final thing is you do have the formal legal codification of international laws. That, that there is this document that countries can then sign up to, saying yes, we agree to this set of rules. And in particular within international law, that consent, in other words, agreement to do something, is the primary source of legal obligation. Right? For countries, for states, there's no way to make them do anything, because there really is nobody above them. Countries only become subject to particular pieces of international law when they agree to be subject to those pieces of law. When they sign and they ratify the treaty or the accords or whatever it is, and nobody can make them do it. So the Kyoto Protocol, the United States didn't sign it or ratify it. Australia didn't. I don't think Russia did. So there are maybe Russia did. So there are big holes in the Kyoto Protocol, and nobody can make, say, the United States sign up to it if they don't want to. And when it comes round to international legal argument, where there's discussion about what does the law mean or what can be done, international law, because it's about countries agreeing to it, the arguments are about rhetoric and not logic. Now, rhetoric is the art of persuading people, the art of persuasion. And so it's not really about what exactly does the law say. It's about, can we convince other people that this is a reasonable way of interpreting it? And in trying to interpret international law in particular situations, then countries will look at other similar situations. They look for analogies, for situations that are quite close to that are reasonably close to the ones that they're dealing with. And you make an argument that, well, in this case, in this other case, this is what happened, this is how it was interpreted, therefore in this case we should be doing whatever it happens to be. And ultimately the debates around international law are not, it's not about somehow the truth of it, it's about acceptability, it's about can we get everybody to agree that this is how we will understand the law, this is how we will interpret it. And if you get people to agree, it's okay, it doesn't in some sense have to be true or logical. And within international legal arguments, you do see changes in the discourse that's used. So, go back to the Iraq War in 2003. The United States was tried very hard within the United Nations to get another Security Council resolution explicitly authorizing the use of force. And there was a big diplomatic effort. The Secretary of State went along, gave his PowerPoint presentations, presenting evidence that supposedly Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction. And all that persuasive stuff is very much part of the legal case they were making. But outside of the United Nations, of course, the United States could behave quite differently. And then you found the United States putting a lot of pressure on its allies to support the United States to join the coalition of the willing. And you would see very different language being used between the attempts within the United Nations, within the diplomatic sphere, to sound reasonable and convince the people who are perhaps against you, and quite a different kind of language being used with close allies to persuade them that they had to support you. So, depending on who's talking to who and where they're talking, you see different kind of language being used in order to convince people. Okay, so now let's look at the change from international to supranational law. In this book, in this course, what does international mean?
Since between states is international.
Yeah, so international, strictly speaking, refers only to the interaction of states. Supranational, what does supra as a prefix mean? Yeah, so above, beyond almost. So supranational law is law that is above or beyond, but really above the nation states themselves, so that they're subject to it. So international law, as it is, in its strictest interpretation, international law can only be applied to states, because that's what it is. And so the states are the subjects of international law. But the states are also the agents of international law. International law can only be created and enforced by the states themselves. It's international, it's only about states. And so you have this interesting situation that the law is created by the nation states, and it applies only to the nation states themselves. And they've got the chance to write the laws that affect them. And so international law was about regulating interstate relations, how to deal with problems between countries. Oh, not necessarily problems as well, just how to manage the relationships between countries. And just to repeat it again, the point of international law is about creating order it isn't necessarily about justice and right. It's whatever the nation states can negotiate between themselves. But, you know, as we've talked about several times in the course, that sure, you've got the countries, there's our map of the world, the different colors represent different countries, and things like Taiwan. But even at the global level, there's actually more to life more to the world than simply the countries themselves. I mean, there are intergovernmental organizations, truly international organizations that exist. Non-governmental organizations, there are many NGOs that exist on a global scale, things like Doctors Without Borders, for example. Some of the big charities work across the world. Amnesty International. So there is more to life than just the countries. Big multinational companies. Some of the biggest multinational companies have got bigger annual budgets than many countries do as well, so they're equally important players. So we need some kind of laws to deal with the world as a whole, such as global governance. Increasingly, there's now development of international human rights law. And within international human rights law, we're starting to see leaders, rulers having to take individual responsibility for violations of international human rights law. So now we do actually have a situation in which there are elements of international law that do apply to individuals and not simply to states. So there's the International Criminal Court that's busy trying to track down various leaders. Charles Taylor, the president of Liberia, got locked up. Now, this one at the end here, R2P, this is the responsibility to protect. This is sort of fallen out of fashion, quite popular just a few years ago. The responsibility to protect is the idea that if a government is unable to, or simply fails to protect its own citizens, then the international community has a right, has a responsibility to step in and protect the people. And if your government can't protect you, the international community should. That's what the responsibility to protect is about. You can see that it's not taken that seriously, because currently the Syrian government is busy killing its own citizens and they're just being allowed to get on with it. But this is where some of the calls to intervene in Syria come from. It's not just about wars. A few years ago there was a big cyclone in the Bay of Bengal, and Myanmar, large part of the coast of Myanmar was flooded. There's sort of 100,000 people without food and water. And the international community, many countries said, yeah, oh, we'll provide help, we'll send food, water, tents. And the government of Myanmar said, no, we don't want it, no, you're not coming in. And there was serious talk, particularly from the French, about saying, we are going to send this food and we're going to send this help, whether the government of Myanmar wants it or not. And that comes under the responsibility to protect. In the end, the French didn't send the stuff in, because that would cause all sorts of problems. But that's what the responsibility to protect is. As I've said, with this idea of global governance, there is the increasing importance of non-state actors, big multinational companies, NGOs. And all of this leads to a concern for global regulation rather than just international regulation. Those regulations that apply not just to countries, but to other organizations that in common use of the word international we would call international or multinational companies, organizations. Okay, so what do the different approaches to international relations tell us about international law? Well, realism. What's realism as a theory of international relations? What's the main point about realism as a theory of international relations?
There's no states, sovereignty.
Yeah, the only thing that counts are the states, the sovereign states themselves and their relationships between them. And that the states themselves are primarily interested, their only interest is their self-interest. Now, that kind of approach really doesn't help us to understand very much about international law, because realism would just say, look, countries might sign up to international agreements, but they're only going to keep those agreements as long as they're in their own interest. They'll only sign up if it's in their own interest, and they'll only stick to those agreements if it is in their own interest. So realism would suggest that international law is not going to work very well, but as I said, actually it does work very well, and countries do stick to it. Neoliberal institutionalism, so the idea here that countries do need to cooperate and do need to create institutions, legal regimes to deal with it. Well, they see the states as being rational egoists. So the egoist bits, they're thinking about themselves, and the rational part is that they do actually make kind of sensible decisions. They consider possible outcomes and choose the outcome that is best for them, taking into account how other states will react. And they see international law as simply being there to regulate the relations between states rather than to actually impose new relations on them. It's just those relations exist. It's what exists. The relationships exist first, and then international law is simply put in place to regulate those relationships, rather than using international law to create new types of relationships and new agreements. Constructivism is a serious idea that that we create the social world that we live in, that people are agents, they have the power to act. It does help us to understand a bit about why international law comes about, is people trying to deal with problems. But it doesn't tell us very much about the different types of norms as to where they've come from. New liberalism is different from this one up here. This says the states are rational egoists, but new liberalism, in looking at international relations, actually looks within the states themselves and says, actually, the state is really, if we look inside the state, there are subsets, there are groups of people with different interests. For example, big business, the military, the church in some countries. And those different groups of people actually have different interests, and they would have, the different groups of people would have the state do different things. And so here you're saying, look, to understand how countries interact with each other, you need to understand which particular group is in charge in that country and what their interests are, because they're going to run the state in their own interests. It still assumes that these groups are rational, and they're also risk averse. They don't want to take risks if they can avoid it. And it still leads to interdependence among the different states, of course. And if you come across critical legal studies, what does this word critical mean in cases like this?
Critique?
Meaning?
To overcome current legal structure.
It's not the same critical as in critical thinking. When you see critical used with things like theories and approaches, but this is where the researchers start from the point of view that there's something wrong with the system. And that the researchers are studying the system not just to understand what it's like, but in order to change it. And so very often, people who take this kind of critical approach to things often come from the left of the political spectrum, from Marxist ideas. The whole idea being that the whole setup of the world at the moment was essentially introduced by capitalism, and that brings with it all these problems, and therefore the critical legal studies at the moment would be sort of saying that the problem is that the United States has too much power, and we need to change the entire international legal regime in order to have a more equal world, to give more power to disadvantaged developing countries. Okay, let's have a quick look at what this might mean for international business. Now, the first thing to say about international business and the law is what we've been talking about here, international law, is about regulating the relationships between countries. There isn't any sort of international law for companies. If you're a company operating in Japan, you've got to operate according to Japanese law, whether you're a Japanese company or not. Japanese companies, people like Toyota making cars in Thailand, they're subject to Thai law. And also to Japanese law as well. So companies can be subject to different laws. America in particular is quite forceful about regulating its own companies, even as they operate overseas. Things like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that makes it illegal for employees of American companies to bribe anybody, even if that action does not take place in the United States, it takes place in some other country, it's illegal under American law. But as businesses, you've got to operate within the legal system of the country that you're working in. And there are, well, 4 different, quite different legal structures and different complications. There's common law, which is what the English system is, the British system. Common law, it works primarily by precedent. Court cases are decided as much by previous decisions, what has happened in similar cases, and judges work on that. Common law, its roots just come from what was accepted as being right. That yes, that's allowable, and no, that's not allowable. And Britain, of course, does have laws. Laws are passed, but the interpretation of the law, it's up to judges to interpret the law based on previous cases, on precedents. Other countries like France has code law. So you've actually got a legal code that attempts to specify everything, what is legal and what is illegal. And then the judge's job in code law systems is to apply the law as it's written, and they've got rather less freedom to go back and look for precedents. Other countries have religious law systems. Saudi Arabia is the best known one. In religious law systems, you know, the law is derived from whatever the holy books are. I mean, you could have one based on the Bible or based on the Quran. And then the judges are religious figures, and it's very much based on that individual judge's interpretation of what the Quran or the Bible actually says. And so it produces a legal system that's really quite uncertain, because you know, different judges can interpret the scriptures in different ways. And then bureaucratic legal systems, they typically do have codes to them, but decisions are made not really with regards to what the law says, but with regards to what the government or the bureaucracy wants to happen. So Russia is an example of this. It always, well, the Soviet Union always was, but these days you very much get the impression that if Vladimir Putin wants it, if Vladimir Putin decides we're going to lock Yoshiko up for 20 years, she's going to get locked up for 20 years, and that's it. And, you know, it doesn't matter what's happened. Russia's just released a number of prisoners, including Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who basically was locked up for falling out with Vladimir Putin. He was accused of evading taxes, and then he was accused of stealing all the oil from his own company or something. And basically everybody believes that it was, whilst he was convicted in court, it was basically just Putin deciding he's going to put a stop to it. So the law, it's not the law that's written, it's the law that the government or the people in power want to apply. As an international business, you know, you just got to know these different kinds of structures and deal with them and understand the kinds of risks that come with them. So doing business in Russia is really quite a risky thing. BP, the big oil company, had problems with a Russian partner there as well. So it's understanding the risks, and I've said this before, that as a business, you will take on risky ventures if you think the reward is big enough. If you think you're going to be able to make money out of it, you'll do it. You just got to get yourself a good lawyer who understands these systems. Right? Common and code law. It's not so much about the type of system that you're dealing with. It's much more about how efficient or how effective the system is. The issue about, okay, what happens if as a company you get into some legal dispute in another country? Okay, the law exists, you know, your lawyer will tell you about it, but the real question is, are you going to get a fair deal? Or are you just going to get locked up? Or will it take forever for the case to be settled? They say that in India, if you open a court case, the first thing you should do is nominate somebody to take over your case when you die, because the legal system works incredibly slowly in India, and that your case will probably not be settled in your lifetime. You've got to worry about that. So, you know, again, knowing about these things, it's knowing about the risks that you're taking in going into business. So, within business in general, there's something called pest analysis or pestle analysis, and this is political, economic, socio-cultural, technological, legal, and environmental. It basically says if you're thinking about investing in another country, you need to consider these different aspects of the country. You've got to analyze them. Now, we're talking here about international law, but we've got political and legal here. Obviously, any country can change its laws. New laws can be introduced. Tax rates can change. That is actually part of the political environment. You know, the chances that, are you going to go there and the government will suddenly say, oh, we're going to nationalize your business or something. It's both about political stability and about the possibility that laws may be changed and become unfavorable to you. The legal one here, this is about the legal environment, and this is about such things as, you know, what's going to happen if you get involved in a court case? Will you find out what you're being charged with? Some countries people never know, they just get locked up. Will you have access to a lawyer? Will it be a fair trial? If you're convicted, will you have a chance to appeal? That's part of the legal risk that's involved. It's how well does the legal system work. And that's quite different from the particular laws that are in place at the moment. They'll be changed by the political system. So you need to look at these aspects of the company. You've got to write your contracts carefully, of course. It sounds like a silly thing to say, but when you're writing contracts, you actually can specify all sorts of things in contracts. As long as you've got to get both sides to agree to it, but you know, which set of laws are you going to use? If you're doing business in Thailand, you're a Japanese company doing business in Thailand, if you have a contract dispute, it needs to be interpreted according to a particular set of laws. Actually, you can write your contract and say, in the event of a dispute in this contract, it will be settled under Japanese law. Even if you're operating in Thailand, that's perfectly legal. Of course, a Thai company will want to use Thai law, but in principle you can do it. I was reading, because I flew Emirates over Christmas, reading something about the Emirates, and they're trying to set up kind of an international court that uses the law of the United Arab Emirates and encouraging people, you know, sign your contracts stating that you're going to use UAE law and you're going to use this court. And you can do that. You know, as long as both sides sign the contract, you can run your contract under any set of laws, and you can agree to have cases heard in any particular set of courts as well. Think about, if you're involved in international business, do think about what could go wrong, and possibly looking at writing into the contract ideas of mediation and arbitration. Mediation is where, if you've got a contract dispute, so two parties disagree about something, both mediation and arbitration are about taking your case to somebody, not to court, but to somebody who will try to help you resolve the dispute. In mediation, the person who helps you will make suggestions, but the two sides have still got to come to an agreement themselves. If you go to arbitration, you agree that this person who helps you will give you a decision and you will accept that decision. That's the difference. Mediation, you get a suggestion, you can act on it or not. Arbitration says we agree that we'll accept whatever decision comes. And there are places you can get mediation and arbitration done. So again, think about writing these into your contracts. It's probably much better than ending up in a court case. And if you're a big multinational company, particularly if you're operating in a developing country, you really want to avoid legal action if possible. One, because you may not be sure that you're going to get a fair trial, but big multinational companies from rich countries operating in developing countries, if you're seen as being a bully, if you're seen as taking advantage, you know, trying to say, eliminate local companies from competition, that is going to produce lots of bad publicity for you, and no company really wants bad publicity. Unless they're Ryanair, which Ryanair just wants any kind of publicity whatsoever. So, try to avoid legal action. If you can, try to settle things. Anybody got any questions? Okay.
As for the first sentence of this chapter, the student of studying international relations tend to study more international politics than international law. I wonder why it does happen, it happens.
I suppose probably just because politics is more interesting. You know, international law in a sense, it just reduces to a series of agreements between states. And so, you know, you can look at them in detail. It's probably not anything like as interesting as the politics, as the why do these things happen, what influences them. The international politics will lead up to the signing of those agreements. I mean, you've got to reach agreement on it in the first place, but I suspect it's just, okay, once you've got these agreements, that's it. Yes. That's a lawyer, I'm not going to be able to answer this.
Slide 4. And I'm not sure the example to second definition, fundamental institution.
So this is about how you actually create a process. So you say, okay, we want, we've got to do something about climate change.
Climate change, for example, Kyoto
Yeah.
is hard.
That is, but it's how do you come up with something like the Kyoto Protocol? You need a set of rules to say how are we going to produce this thing called the Kyoto Protocol that people will sign, and that's what this is about. It's the way in which you go about negotiating and creating these things.
So detail is hard, and the concept is.
Yeah. So, where did the Kyoto Protocol come from? So you say, okay, well, if we want to have this agreement on climate change, here's how we'll go about it. We need to collect. We've got to get the scientific evidence that we want. Then we have to have these different kinds of conferences. Which kinds of people meet to negotiate these things, and how do they sign it? That's how do you create one of these? The rules that lie behind creating international, to create that particular issue-specific agreement.
So who can create a treaty or protocol?
Yeah, and how you deal with them, how do you register them, what allows us to say yes, this is international law? The Kyoto Protocol is a piece of international law. So I come in with my piece of paper and say, can you just sign up to the BEO protocol, please? And everybody in the world's going to have to look after it. So
based on Asako-san's interpretation, issue-specific institution is like as an agent to do process.
well, these are the treaties that you get in at the end of the day, as it were. So the Kyoto Protocol is an example of this. It's an agreement that deals with one particular issue: global warming, climate change. There's one on banning landmines, and again, that's a single issue. So that's the agreement that you've come up with. But in order to arrive at that agreement, you've got to have some set of rules that say this is the process that we have to go through to produce a piece of international law, and that's what this set of rules here is about. This is how you create. These are the rules that allow you to create one of these. Well, if you want to think of this more like domestic law, as it were, then these are the laws themselves, right? And this is the set of rules that governs how the Diet works in order to produce a new law. Well, it's the rules that, not who it is doesn't matter, it's the rules that are used in order to produce a law. So the rules that govern the functioning of the diet, for example, you know, you've got to have some, bills have got to pass 3 times or whatever, and they've got to have, and we've got to have a minimum number of people there at quorum, whatever. That whole set of rules that says if we don't do all of this, the law isn't valid at the end of the day. That's what we mean. That's what we're talking about here.
Another question, just talking about slide 9, in the international business. I couldn't get the specific difference meaning of euro and states. Yes, because when you giving some example about Russia is one of the states. So,
Bureaucratic.
Bureaucratic law is in line on idea of states.
In systems where you've got a bureaucratic law system, I mean, you've probably got a code law system. To see, I mean, there are some laws, but where you've got a bureaucratic legal system, the courts essentially are under the control of the government, and so decisions are made not by judges. The real decisions are not made by the judges and the courts. They're made by the government or the people in power who just tell the judge, lock Yoshiko up for 20 years. And it happens, and Yoshiko says, what did I do? It doesn't matter. I mean, that essentially is what happened with Mikhail Khodorkovsky in Russia. Or at least that's what everybody believes. Supposedly he was convicted of not paying taxes and stealing oil from his own company. Nobody outside of Russia believes that. So why did the courts reach that decision? Because Vladimir Putin said, lock him away, he's challenging me. And so basically, in a bureaucratic system, the law itself doesn't really count for anything. The government just decides you're guilty. Well, the government decides we want to lock you up. You look like a political rival, so we're going to charge you with something and lock you away. Yeah, assuming they don't kill you, because that's another possibility as well. Russia. Yep.
International law doesn't say anything
about locking people up, about locking Yoshiko up. No, in the strictest of senses, international law regulates relationships between countries. And you're still left with the idea that within a country, it's a sovereign country, so within the country the government can do what it wants to its own people. The responsibility to protect is an attempt at least to sort of say, well, actually the international community does have an ability to act within the country. But if it's just individuals like Khodorkovsky, he's just going to be, he was left in jail for 10 years. And Putin let him out.
Does it include he is Russian?
Well, he's a Russian in Russia, so... I mean, ultimately, Khodorkovsky got out because the Germans were sort of negotiating and helping him do it. But for just one individual, the world isn't going to get involved. People in China are under house arrest, for example. So organizations like, say, Amnesty International can campaign, but there's very little you can do inside another country. It's a sovereign state. You can put pressure on, you say that you should release him, or we're not going to trade with you, or whatever. But there's nothing really you can do about it. Any others? Yes?
This environment is just about business scene?
This is pest analysis, or pestle analysis is used for a company thinking about starting business in another country. So you've got to examine the political environment. How stable is it politically? Is your company going to get nationalized or something like that? The level of economic development of the country, if you're selling very expensive products, probably not worth selling them in developing countries. How big is your market share? Social, cultural, don't decide you're going to start selling sake in Saudi Arabia. It's not a very good idea. But, this is part of it. Do your products fit with the way society behaves in that country? Alcohol and pork products in Muslim countries are not going to work very well because of cultural issues. Level of technological development in the country you're looking at as well. So, in some cases, high-tech equipment, again, is probably not the best thing for some developing countries. If you've got to sell something in developing countries, if it's a piece of equipment that needs to be kept cool, air-conditioned rooms, clean rooms, or whatever, it's probably not going to work very well in developing countries. So I get you. So you've got to match the technological level of your products with the technological level of the country you're dealing with. Right, you've got to decide: is this going to work? If you got something that's that needs a lot of maintenance, that it works really well, but you've got to have somebody cleans it every day and looks after it. Again, you've got to think, well, does the country have enough trained people that they can maintain this? Or am I going to send my equipment and after 2 days it'll be broken and not work? And so you might actually want something of a lower technological level that maybe doesn't work as efficiently but is much easier to repair. And so that would sell well. Just these legal issues about how good is the legal system, how well does it work. You've got to think about environmental issues around that. Can you have a factory and pollute the other country, or do they have very high levels of environmental protection, in which case it's going to be very expensive to manufacture things there because protecting the environment costs money. This just breaks down, instead of just saying you've got to study the country, you've got to do business, and it breaks it down into particular areas and helps you to focus on it. We need to think about these issues to decide whether we're going to do business there and how we're going to do business there as well. Anything else? Okay, break time then. I'll come back and do some quantitative analysis.